Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ruben Martinez, and I want to welcome you to the Future U Forum. Today's forum features Professor Clyde Barrow, not to be mistaken for his predecessor down in South Texas, and we're really excited to have him. Also with me today is my colleague, Frank Fear, who has been with us since the very beginning. We started this forum right after we held an international conference on neoliberalism and public higher education back in 2015. And so I really appreciate him staying with us. The purpose of the forum is to continue to have dialogues about the influence of neoliberalism and public higher education, and to not only identify the different influences, but also discuss ways by which we might recover the true mission of the Academy. With that, I will have Frank introduce himself, and we'll ask Fred to introduce himself, and then I will introduce our guest speaker today. So Frank.
Well, thank you very much, Ruben, and thanks to you, Clyde and Fred, for being here. I've looked forward to this forum, as Ruben mentioned. I'm a professor emeritus at Michigan State University and have been working with Ruben on these forums for a number of years now, and we found them to be very engaging. And thanks all of you for being here today, both in the Zoom room and also watching live on YouTube.
Thanks, Frank. And Fred?
I'm Fred Poston. I'm a vice president and professor emeritus for Michigan State. I've served with Frank and Ruben for many years. I was Dean of Agriculture and Natural Resources and Vice President for Finances and Operations, those two jobs at Michigan State. And so I bring those experiences to the forum.
Thank you, Fred, and welcome. Following our guest presentation today, Fred will make some comments, and then Frank will make some comments, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A. So I am very pleased to introduce Professor Clyde Barrow. He is currently over at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley, which is about as south as you can get in this country. He has been there for a few years, I think since about 2014, but he spent the majority of his career over at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth, where he rose to be a chancellor professor. He is a sociologist, having obtained his doctoral degree in political science out of the University of California, Los Angeles, and he has been writing on the state for a few years. He has been engaging as well in conversations about the rise of the entrepreneurial university, and we're very, very pleased to have him here today. His presentation is entitled The Entrepreneurial Intellectual in the Corporate University. So with that, Professor Barrow, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. I'm going to try to load up a PowerPoint here, so just bear with me for 1 second. And there it is. It looks like it's going to more or less work. Well, I guess that's as good as it's going to get for now. But let me see. Okay, well, that's as good as it's going to get. I'm going to spend on time on the technology of this. I really appreciate you having me here today. I really enjoy what the Future U Forum is doing in terms of thinking about the future of higher education. And in fact, part of my critique in the Entrepreneurial Intellectual is that we spend far too much time talking about the past of the university instead of about its future. And that leads me really to the point of this book, which I just published a few years ago on the Entrepreneurial University. I'll just start with, what is it? Well, one of the things that I hope it is what I called an opening salvo in a fourth wave critique of the corporate university. And what I mean by that is that we think of critical university studies, as it's come to be called, as something comparatively new that emerged only in the 1990s or even in the 2000s. But the reality is there's a very rich literature criticizing the corporate university that, of course, goes back to the early parts of the 20th century. Thorstein Veblen's Higher Learning in America being the most prominent example of that. But we saw a similar wave of critiques during the 1930s and 40s coming out of the Great Depression. And then, of course, a third wave that began in the 1990s. And basically, I've just took what was a footnote in one of my papers and dropped it onto this slide as just an example of just a very selective example of all the books that have been written on this subject just in recent years. And one of my, and as much as I admire this literature, I want to say, one of the problems with it is that every generation, we just repeat Thorstein Veblen, and that we really don't break forward toward anything new. We sort of update Veblen with each generation of scholars, but we never move forward beyond the corporate university. And so one of the things I wanted to try to do is think about how we move beyond the corporate university and maybe even turn some of its own rhetoric against itself. Now, in terms of what specifically the book is, I'm not going to have nearly enough time to talk about everything that I cover in this book, but it's basically an autoethnographic account of what I consider having been an entrepreneurial intellectual in the corporate university. And basically, the core of the book is a discussion of my experiences and those of my colleagues when I was director of the UMass Center for Policy Analysis for about 22 years or so. And it was a very successful entrepreneurial venture. It transformed those who worked with it in many ways. We basically had, as we document, an impact on a very impoverished region of the state of Massachusetts and throughout New England in terms of job creation, working with nonprofit organizations, with distressed school systems, with financially distressed municipal governments, and a whole range of things. And along the way, we also generated a lot of revenue in doing it. On good years, we were doing well over $600,000 or $700,000 per year in revenue, sometimes with what I would call a profit rate in the range of 40 or 50%. So we didn't just generate revenue to cover the costs of our projects. We generated what I would call profits, or surplus revenues, we called it, because you can't use that word profit in the university. Some of it we plowed back into doing pro bono projects for nonprofit organizations that couldn't afford to pay for them. Some of it we used to sort of feather our own nests in terms of travel money and journal subscriptions and a whole range of things I talk about. But we basically viewed it as doing well for ourselves as we were doing good for others. And sort of the impetus for this was that terrible recession up in the Northeast in 1990-91, which at the time was known as the Great Recession, before the next Great Recession and the next one after that. But essentially what we came to the conclusion was that we really never wanted to go through that again, in the sense that we did not want to be financially dependent as professors on the state legislature, on the whims of budgets, and that we were going to create an organization where we could generate our own revenues, support our own research, support our own salaries, and basically establish a degree of autonomy on the margins of the institution. I won't talk a lot about this, but let me say that it worked partly because we had a chancellor who at the time was very much committed to a similar vision of entrepreneurialism and public service. She kept the wolves at bay for many, many years. We were fighting with the Senate, we were fighting with the union, and I was a union officer. We were fighting with the staff, and when she retired, this enterprise was over within a couple of years, and I left. Another aspect of this that's different is, if you're familiar with my work, is I wanted to write something from the perspective of a lived experience. So what is it like to be an entrepreneurial intellectual from within the university, rather than the kinds of structural institutional analyses that characterize that list of books that I started with, including my own on universities in the capitalist state. And of course, many, many times over the years at conferences, people had told me either, well, Clyde, you're making this up, or you're exaggerating these experiences, or the other was, you have to put this in writing, man. You've got to get this down because we're all going through this similar kind of experience, and it's the kind of thing that we don't write about, particularly in political science. And so what I'm really doing here is writing how, as I write it, became disenchanted with the existing critiques of the corporate university. And it's not just a critique of the university. In some ways, it's a critique of what I call bureaucratic intellectuals. And this is a term that I take from Robert K. Merton's Social Theory and Social Structure, basically arguing that we are surrounded by colleagues whose consciousness is imprisoned in Max Weber's iron cage of bureaucracy, which has in many ways been locked and closed behind us. So what is the book not? Well, it's not a solution to what I call the problem of the intellectuals that will likely appeal to most professors. And that is because, as I write, I think that entrepreneurialism and bureaucratism are diametrically opposed, that most intellectuals are fairly comfortably ensconced in their corporate routines as much as they complain about them. It doesn't offer a full-blown theory or model of an alternative university, although I have begun to work on that and have written a paper on it, which I've presented. But what I do offer is what I call flickering glimpses that are anchored in the political economy of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. So I call this an anarcho-syndicalist or an anarcho-communist critique of the corporate university, as contrasted to Marxist, liberal, and conservative critiques, which abound at this time, including my own. Now, in doing so, I adopt a fairly standard definition of the corporate university, which I've taken from an article by Henry Steck, that we are now an institution characterized by processes, decisional criteria, expectations, culture, operating practices that are taken from the modern business corporation. In my own book on universities in the capitalist state, I trace the actual origins of that process all the way back to the early 20th century to document how this has not just been some spontaneous event or natural adaptation to life in a capitalist society, but it was a project that was initiated by corporate foundations, by state political elites, and that it has been a consistent ongoing project that sort of pushed forward in waves over the last 100 years or so. And every time we get a forward push, we get this critical university studies literature surfaces as if this was the first time that it ever happened. And what I've been trying to emphasize in the book is that in many respects, this has been the last and final wave of corporatization in my view, because it has so completely overcome and overtaken the university that it is triumphant. And that rather than thinking about how to resist it, we now have to think about how do we go beyond it from within it. And that's part of what I've been trying to do. In the interest of saving time, I'm not going to go through all of the different points that define the structure of a corporate university, but because in my book, I really focus on only one of 8 of the criteria that Steck identifies, and that is the development of new entrepreneurial activities and the creation of new organizational structures and relationships. And so what I'm focused on is my experiences at the Center for Policy Analysis at UMass Dartmouth as an example of what a genuinely entrepreneurial activity at a university would look like, as opposed to what I would call the fictional entrepreneurial activities, which really are just bureaucratic science, subsidies to large corporations, subsidies to the state. Because one of the important things, if you look at how economists define entrepreneurialism, entrepreneurial profit refers to the net income earned by the owner of the business. And that takes us to the core issue about who owns the university. And another way, as I put it, is if we're going to accept the idea, and I don't say accept the idea, accept the reality that the university is now a business corporation. Even Max Weber called it a state capitalist enterprise as early as 1917. Then as a faculty member, I want to own shares in that corporation. I want to reclaim the full value of what I have produced as an owner-producer. I want to be an owner of the institution, not an employee of the institution. Otherwise, sort of paraphrasing Proudhon, intellectual property is theft. You're basically taking from me what I have produced as an entrepreneur and using it to subsidize or redistribute to people who didn't contribute to the value of the institution. And really, one of the big tensions with our center was the amount of money that we generated that we controlled and that we effectively owned because we operated outside the structure of the university bureaucracy, outside the structure of Office of Sponsored Research. And we can talk more about that later as to how that was set up. But it's basically, we were an institution at the university, but we operated more like a private consulting firm. In fact, so much so that we purposely changed our name at one point to call ourselves the Center for Policy Analysis at UMass Dartmouth, rather than the UMass Dartmouth Center for Policy Analysis, as if to sort of convey the image that we were located there, but we weren't really part of the regular structure of the institution. Now, what am I criticizing? Well, what I would suggest is that professors have basically developed what I call two competing ideologies of the intellectuals in response to corporatization. One of these is what I call the myth of the autonomous intellectual and the myth of the golden age of the university. This is an idea that universities institutionalize intellectuals as an autonomous social category, insulated from the direct influence of corporations and the state. You know, some of the examples of that are Cardinal Newman's book, The Idea of a University, Mannheim, Hofstadter, Merton, all make this point. And the argument is that the university therefore allows intellectuals to pursue knowledge for its own sake. And in some ways, that's a vision that's been operationalized through the AUP, to some degree through faculty senates. And so the political strategy this leads to is that as the university has been corporatized, we have fallen away from this wonderful golden age that ostensibly existed at some point in the past, and that the strategy is to reclaim that lost golden age, to reestablish shared governance. And my argument is there was never a golden age. If you look at the actual history of the American university, there was no golden age. It has always been effectively a class struggle from the beginnings of the modern university. Now, the other response to that, which first emerges around the 1920s in Upton Sinclair's The Goose Step, which is actually a great and even entertaining book if you get the chance to read it, where he argues that the universities have been captured by big business. They operate it as an ideological apparatus, that employees are now just employees of capital, servants of the state. We're no different than any other worker. We share the same class interests as the proletariat, so we should join working class organizations. And of course, that's a vision institutionalized mainly through unions, the AFT, later the NEA, the Collective Bargaining Conference. And so it's a different way of viewing it. Rather than being an autonomous, we are subordinate to capital, engaged in a class struggle. Now, what's my criticism of those two ideologies? Well, my main criticism is that both of them accept the existing capitalist relations of production as the legal framework of our economic and political action. One seeks minor economic gains, one seeks limited political influence, but neither challenges the fundamental structure of the institution as it exists today. Neither offers a transformative vision of an alternative university. And so what I argue, that's one part of it. The other part is that we've failed. Neither of these strategies has slowed down, much less reversed, this century-long project to corporatize universities and to functionally integrate them into the structure of corporate capitalism. And so what I suggest is, after 111 years of losing, isn't it time to try something different? Because my argument here is that corporatization, I'm being a little hyperbolic here, but you know, we're headed toward what I call a corporate fascist university, and we only saw the first glimpses of that in Florida this last week. But we're really at a stage where we're not just going to be a corporate university, but these boards of trustees and state elites are becoming very aggressive in their assaults on academia, and it's only going to get worse, in my view, regardless of what happens on national and state political arenas. So, what is an entrepreneurial intellectual? Well, again, I'm being a little sort of hyperbolic here for purposes of polemical purposes. But the way I described it in the book was, first of all, that we need to dissociate our identity from the university and more come to look at it as a collection of office buildings. You know, if you look at sort of high-tech corporations now, they call their office complexes campuses, just like universities. And I'm suggesting that as we practice our craft, we more and more need to look at the university, not as our identity, but as just a place. It's a place where we work. It's a place where we do our activities, but it doesn't define us as a class. It doesn't define our cultural orientations. It doesn't define any collective identity. That has to come through these entrepreneurial organizations, which I argue is more of a small group activity. And that the more we accelerate that tendency, the better it is. But the alternative is it's going to require intellectuals to embrace risk, competitiveness, independence, even the marketization of our skills and knowledge. Because I think one of the things I find most frustrating is the extent to which professors undervalue the economic value of their skills and knowledge, which generates billions of dollars a year for somebody, but not for us. And basically, I'd say turn neoliberalism against itself and reclaim that for ourselves. Now, I argue that it's not a broad strategy for subverting the bureaucracy. You know, as we practice it, it was kind of a micro strategy. It operated at the margins of the bureaucracy, at the margins of the corporate university. It was never popular with the majority of the faculty on my campus, nor with the staff, nor with the administration, nor with the Senate, nor with the union. And one of the things we eventually came to realize was the mere existence of a kind of semi-autonomous entrepreneurial organization was a threat to every component of the bureaucracy. It didn't matter what we did, nor matter how we fulfilled the mission of the institution. Our mere presence was a threat to that bureaucracy. So it was a kind of micro subversion, as I pointed out earlier. The moment that sort of the protection provided us by a chancellor disappeared, not only did our center disappear within a couple of years, every single entrepreneurial center on campus was literally wiped out within about 5 years. So the irony of it was it still depended on a certain kind of benevolent administration. And in fact, we found our chancellor fighting with her own administration to protect this entrepreneurial vision that got shut down. So in the interest of time, I'm going to end it right there. And, you know, we can talk more about details if people have questions, but I know that there are others that are going to have comments.
Thank you very much, Clyde. Now we'll turn it over to Freddie for some comments.
Well, it's interesting listening to Clyde, I wish I could have spent more time with Clyde ahead of this listing. Having been sort of at the top of a mega university, I guess I was one of the people in charge of the corporation, so to speak, in that regard. And there are parts of the corporation, I think, that could actually benefit greatly from the approach he's talking about, but there are other parts in certain types of universities, like in land-grant universities, that it's very difficult to function that way and maintain the political support outside the university that you need for the institution to succeed. But threading the needle to do that, you open yourself up to the politics. And of course, the politics come to bear in the trustees. And I'm well aware of what the trustees can do to put pressure on academia. So it's a shell game to stay ahead of all of that as you go. But there are definitely parts of institutions, I think, that could succeed greatly by using that approach. But I also can see exactly what you're talking about, Clyde, in that's a very threatening concept within an institution.
Thank you, Fred. Frank, some comments, and then I would invite others to submit questions through the chat.
Thank you very much, Ruben and Clyde. How to frame this? Maybe the best way to say is, boy, I wish we had had a conversation 30 years ago. I could have bet, well, and in my arrogant youth, still arrogant old age, I'm not sure it would have gotten through anyway. But the reason we wanted to invite you today is that, and I think I can speak for Ruben here too, is that we have not found another frame of reference that has been as useful and informative. And this is another point that I think is important, that a faculty member, administrator can pick up and not get lost in the verbiage. Because you're writing about your lived experience, people can reflect on their lived experience. And a couple of the points you make in the book and you've made in the presentation here, I think are extremely important. And I've seen this so many times in life. First, we sometimes forget that we live in that iron cage of bureaucracy. We think we don't, but we are a victim of it. It's the way we think about things. It's the approach we take. At the same time, we criticize it in a very emotional way in some cases. And I plead guilty on that. But we are also doing our best to put in more of those bars of that iron cage. And so one of the things that's so critical and it's so difficult is to let go of what we know so well and to conclude there is another way, there is another approach that is new to us. And so we become vulnerable because we're going to have to learn our way into a new way of being. The other point you made, which reminds me of conversations I've had with community organizers, is, and it's linked to the point I just made, we assume, often wrongfully so, that the organizing principle needs to be the institution. It needs to be whatever we're affiliated with capital letters. For me, for years, it was Michigan State University, capital letters. And I remember having a wonderful conversation with a community organizer who was celebrating his 100th birthday. And I asked him, what are things that you learned over the years? This person happened to be a minister. And he said, I learned very early in my 20s that the church will fail as an organizing principle for social justice. The church can be a platform for it. But he said, every time I put forward an initiative where the church, capital C, was the organizing principle, there would be the knock at the door, the telephone would ring, and people higher in the bureaucracy would say, what the hell are you doing? And then he shifted from an organizing principle to an organizing platform. And it was a really brilliant thing he did. They were able to purchase a facility that was off the campus of the church, where they would hold their meetings to organize. And I think we too often, and Fred knows me well, I've been duped multiple times. I think maybe for the good reason, but it's what I knew, that, well, the university has to be the organizing principle. And I was involved actively in two national movements for change, in two different dimensions of university mission, one in teaching and learning and the other in outreach service. And I'm not saying that good things didn't happen, and they did, good things did happen, but the gap between the rhetoric of what a national movement was going to bring higher education and the reality of what it brought, 20 years later is laughable. And yet, if we just applied what we know about movements, we would have said, you could have predicted that. You could have predicted that. You should have known that. But when you're in the midst of it, you don't. And the last point I'll make, and that's one of the reasons we wanted Fred here, is your point is so critical, Clyde, that there are faculty leaders who do and are capable of doing exactly what you did in your work at University of Massachusetts and elsewhere. But, and there's a huge but, without administrative support, first of all, administrative understanding, administrative endorsement, administrative support, which Fred Poston offered is not a strong enough word, which he ensured at both the college and the university level. None of the work, a good share of the work that I was involved in just simply wouldn't have been possible. And what's amazing about it is if that space is cleared and there's administrative endorsement for it, you see spectacular things happen. I hope Fred will talk a little bit later about the work, his work on the sustainable campus. In that particular situation, you saw a large number of not only faculty members, graduate students, undergraduates, but also operations side of the university at the same table, thinking thoughts, planning forward, and doing things like, I'm thinking of the MSU water program, where we looked at the Red Cedar River that flows through campus, the Red Cedar watershed, and there was a conversation with community leaders across the watershed, what Michigan State should do. And then it did something very important, and that is the university looked at itself. How much water are we using in the research labs? How can we conserve water? How much food waste is there in the cafeteria system? And what can we do to lower the amount of food waste, so that we don't talk about sustainability as an it and promulgate what others should do? We will practice as best we can to be a shining light for sustainability. And that leads me to the very last point, is that it seems to me that particularly for public universities, we do an awful lot of good work in an awful lot of areas. But that one area that you talk about in the work you did at UMass, Clyde, it gets underplayed even in the engagement movement, university engagement movement. I'll be the first to say there are a lot of ways in which faculty engage. There's a lot of good work that can be done. There are a lot of wonderful objectives that can occur. But the one that fits the motif of a public university is to serve the public good, to serve those who are underserved, to address issues that aren't from deep pockets, from corporations, from foundations, from other enterprises, where the general public is served in ways that befit what a public university should be. So I really appreciate, Clyde, your work. As I said, I wish I had been open enough, and I'm not sure I would have been, to absorb it had I read it 20 years ago, and also to have Fred here for the incredible work that he did to clear the space administratively for the work that I and so many others did at Michigan State. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Frank. Clyde, do you have any reactions to the comments that have been made?
I'm trying to think. Those are very interesting and good comments. I think I'm going to respond to the question that's in the chat here instead.
Okay.
I may address some of that as we go along. I think what I'm talking about, the question here has to do, is this really different than the discourse about scholar activism and things like that? And I think it is. I think it's a very different discourse. As I mentioned, that where this began was a response to the Great Recession of 1991 and to a fiscal crisis. And it was a decision by a small group of faculty that our first objective was to find a mechanism that would give us the financial autonomy to not be dependent upon the state legislature the top administration and whatever whims might motivate them. And I have to say that part of what brought us to this conclusion was don't look to either of the two existing parties as your salvation. When I was in Massachusetts in 1991, everybody was complaining about the fact that William Weld, who had just been elected as a libertarian Republican, cut the UMass budget by $70 million. But what they immediately forgot was that Michael Dukakis had proposed cutting it by $100 million because he had other priorities, and neither of the two parties is going to take us back to this age that many of us remember when state appropriations covered 60-70% of the university budget. It's never going to happen again. And so our first goal was to find a source of revenue that we controlled and that was independent of that legislature. What we found was there are lots of people who are out there prepared to compensate us for our services and for our research. We never once applied for a federal grant, not once. Everything we did was sometimes for state government agencies, sometimes for nonprofits, for school districts, for labor unions, and so we were making hundreds of thousands instead of millions, like people who get an NSF grants. But it's far more than most of us in the social sciences and humanities are used to working with on a day-to-day basis. But I do want to mention about getting the credit. Every time some chemist would get $100,000 grant, right? They'd put out a press release and put it in the newspaper. And I used to point out that our center does 5 and 6 times that much every year. It just comes in small pieces. It comes in pieces of $5,000 or $10,000 or $20,000. And that the impact of what we do is far greater, and I could document through economic impact analyses that we had created, or I won't say we were participating in creating thousands of jobs in a place with high levels of unemployment, addressing issues of educational underattainment, high rates of unemployment in very important ways. Somehow that wasn't seen as economic development, but if an engineer went out and invented some new app for tweeners, they couldn't wait to go sell the patent for that and call it economic development. And yet the reality was we were doing more for economic development than anybody in the business school or anybody in the engineering school. But it was kind of, well, that's social science over there. That's politics, what you guys are doing over there. So yeah, we never did really fully get the credit for it because people in some ways didn't understand it. But I think the key was here is it's not, what we did was not a movement. It was a small group of people, faculty, students, some staff, and that gave us an incredible amount of maneuverability, a great deal of flexibility. As I mentioned before, one of the most important things that happened was when the chancellor finally gave up on the Office of Sponsored Research and told us, don't send anything to them. And by the way, you don't have to pay any indirect cost to anybody. But the other side of that deal is you cover all of your costs. So, right, we bought our own equipment. We did all the repairs on our own building. We paid for the snow plows. We paid for the janitorial work. We paid for everything. And I can tell you, once all those costs got internalized into the organization, I'm sure no economist will be surprised by the fact that suddenly we became very cost conscious because every dollar we spent was a dollar we didn't keep. And it actually became a more efficient operation because we internalized all these indirect costs into our budget.
Thank you, Clyde. Fred, did you have more to add about the sustainable campaign on campus?
Well, Frank had asked me to relay some of the experiences we had over for me about a 14-year period relating to campus sustainability. And I would first say I was vice president for finance and operations at Michigan State University, which essentially encompassed all the non-academic parts of the university, which this was an illuminating experience for me because I'm an entomologist, and They didn't cover finance and administrative operation in the entomology curriculum. So I found myself in this job I agreed to do it for 6 months, and it lasted 14 years. I quickly learned, I was in a mega university. We had about 5,300 contiguous acres, over 500 buildings. About 2,000 of those acres were agricultural. There were two 18-hole golf courses in it. We had 50,000 students on one campus, 10,000 faculty and staff. It was a huge resident and food service operation. At the time, short of the US Army, I think we had the largest residence program in the country at that point. They served over 58,000 meals a day. We had a $2 billion portfolio, had a police force, Big Ten athletics program. We were self-sufficient for electrical power and water, as Frank was alluding to the water before. So it was basically a small city. And I approached that. I remember visiting with the assistant directors or assistant vice presidents. I said, I don't know how to do your job, but I don't really have to. I have you. And I delegate. And essentially, that's the approach I've always used to administration. And so when you do that, you can basically surround yourself with competent people and make a lot of progress. So applying that principle, I quickly realized that there were really two parts to any large university. There's the academic part where I'd lived all those years, and the non-academic part. And it is shocking how little interaction there really is between those two parts of the university. Even though the non-academic part is there to fundamentally support the academic part. And so I looked at that and I decided that, we had a number of initiatives as I realized I was going to be there for a while that I would like to get done. And a big part of it was campus sustainability. A lot of universities had essentially made a big splash about goals with no real plan to get there on sustainability. And it reminded me of when I first went to school in Texas, and people used to say, if you're interested in where somebody is going, implies to organizations as well, don't look at their lips, look at their feet. And so what I wanted to do was concentrate on feet during that. And so for the campus sustainability initiative, we started off and we put together a cross-campus sustainability initiative. We did this, as Frank mentioned earlier, by combining really activists from across the academic areas of the campus that were really interested in this. And then ideally, they were people that sat around the coffee table complaining that the university didn't implement one program or another that would further sustainability. We did that with students, graduate students, undergraduates, and staff. And we quickly found the faculty and the students were extremely excited about it because they had an opportunity to see their ideas implemented. And the staff were extremely excited about it because it was so intellectually stimulating to be able to interact with the faculty and some new ideas and new approaches and not locked into all this bureaucracy that Clyde was talking about. And so when we did that, I should mention, I also had a person that worked with me as Assistant Vice President, Kathy Lindahl. Kathy managed all of the systems team and all the subcommittees and the rest that went with that. And she basically worked with all of the groups to feather all the pieces together so the whole system worked. We were going to reduce our environmental footprint. We were going to reduce greenhouse gases, deal with solid waste disposal in the landfill by reducing it. And we had excess animal waste from our research farms we were going to address. The first thing we did was join the Chicago Climate Exchange, which produced a great deal of controversy in the state legislature. Clyde was alluding to before, because we had some politicians that just were convinced that was a waste of money and climate change didn't exist. We've all heard that. But the benefit of it was we did an audit of our net greenhouse gas emissions, which was extremely illuminating. And then we developed goals out of that. We ended up modeling our electric and steam systems across the campus, which turned out to be extremely complex. We used a firm, Confluence Incorporated, to help us do that. And then we went through and really fine-tuned our whole operation. And we found a lot of savings, both in terms of money, but also in terms of gas reduction into the atmosphere from that. We developed a nutrient management model for solid waste across the campus. And we had a choice. We could either constrain our research programs and reduce the number of experimental animals, or we could develop an outlet for solid waste. So we built a composting facility in that and sold the excess compost. We put a lot of that compost on the campus proper, which reduced our fertilizer bill across the campus, which made and improved the soil across the campus. We audited our food waste in the halls, and it was shocking how much was actually going into the landfill as a consequence. And so we ended up building a commercial size digester that we put food waste and manure in, generated methane, and then burned the methane in our power plant. So we had that benefit. It did produce a great deal of controversy with the landfill folks, because they wanted all of that food waste in the landfill to generate methane. I offered to sell it to them, Clyde, but they declined in the whole process. So we audited recycling on the campus, and one of the things that we saw was we had a waste hauler that would come in and was supposedly recycling. All he was doing was stripping out the white paper and landfilling and charging us for it for the rest of the recycling. And of course, the stuff that had to be landfilled. Well, we ended up building a comprehensive recycling center on the campus, which basically the revenue from that paid for the cost of the recycling. I should have mentioned that one of the first things we did was rework our whole finance system. And we had about, out of a couple $1 billion a year, we had about $400 million in cash at any one time. That's a lot of cash. We invested that cash. And when it was all over with, we were, along with some other changes, we were generating about $70 million extra dollars a year. So I took half of that and I subsidized tuition for students. And the other half we used for initiatives and to bill things. I put some faculty on retainers. They worked in the committees constantly because you needed it was more than a one-time set of ideas, but and so they were engaged with the non-academic units that implemented that. We did a water initiative, a big one, as Frank's talking about. And everybody in the physical plant was convinced we weren't dumping a whole bunch of stuff in the river. And in the audit that we did, we found out we had 66 outlets from across the campus that nobody knew about that were going into the river that had all sorts of strange things in it. So we cleaned up and plugged those, and so there was a whole long line list of these things. By and large, we just used a process, incremental adjustments. We didn't do a big wave approach and create a movement. I wasn't impressed with the results of those types of activities. And we implemented that. And if you'd use that approach, over a decade, you can make a humongous impact. And so we exceeded all of our goals. We'd set 2015 goals. We exceeded them greatly. And I think they are still engaged in that. I retired in 2015, so I've kept my nose out of the tent. But as I look at some of the things that they have put forth in terms of planning documents, it would appear that they're still continuing on with those things.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a question, Fred.
Yes.
That I wonder if one of the most difficult things for you as an administrator, in order to encourage that type of entrepreneurial activity, is the ability to let go.
Yes.
Because people are out there doing things that you're not micromanaging, and you have to trust those people to do a good job without your supervision a lot of the time.
Well, in fact, having worked my way as a faculty member through administrative ranks, I quickly came to that same conclusion, Clyde, and that, we've all worked with people who had to have their hand on everything. Yep. And, when that happens, all the brain power that you have really comes to rest in one person. There's a lot of brain power that you're not using if you use that approach. So I quickly learned to delegate, and 9 times out of 10, the person I delegated it to would do a better job than I would have been able to do in the process. A lot of it is the art of just weaving all of it together to be able to fit into work. And Frank was one of my department chairs at the time, and we used to talk about an approach with all of my chairs. I'd tell them, I'd find out what they were trying to get done, and I'd help them do that as long as they would help me do some of my stuff. And in the process, we made a lot of progress, I think. But you have to be willing to trust that people will. Now, when somebody proves that they're not trustworthy, well, then that you have to do something else. But
Yeah.
Thank you, Fred. I like this conversation. Reminds me of a conversation I had with the community college president years ago when I was working on a Ford Foundation grant on community college leadership. And I asked him about his style of leadership. And his response was, well, I kind of just tell him where I think we need to get the college to go. And then I fall in behind them and see if I can keep them in sight. That's a good approach.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I want to ask you a couple of questions for the benefit of our listeners, Clyde. So you're talking, your initiative over at Dartmouth really was about research.
Yes.
But the influences of neoliberalism on the public universities span the whole spectrum. So just recently I was talking to a person who was actually at a private Calvin theology institution where, he was doing he taught in intellectual thought of the 16th, 17th century. And he started using some of the fonts in his syllabi. And they told him that he had to use standard Times New Roman or something like that. So, it brings to mind the kind of standardization that is being brought about, the lack of faculty control even over their own syllabi and so on. So can you speak to these other dimensions that neoliberalism is impacting?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that I'll just go back to my experience at UMass Dartmouth, that I focused on my own center. But over the course of, say, a decade, our university campus eventually developed 10 or 12 comparable centers in a wide variety of fields. We had people working in biotech, but we had a center for Indic studies, a center for Portuguese studies. We had a center for marketing research, and I could go on and on, one that dealt with gerontology. And so the reality was some of these were were doing education reform. Some of them were working in healthcare. Some of them were working in developing curriculum that could be used at both the university and at the high school level in these different fields. So there were people doing this kind of work across a range of activities. It wasn't just the kind of applied policy research that we were doing at our center. And one of the things that most fascinated me was that as this kind of network emerged, we found ourselves subcontracting to each other all the time. So a sort of internal market developed within the university where, for example, we had somebody who was working on the local Portuguese community. They needed some survey research done. So they subcontracted that to us because we had the survey research center. There were times when we would be doing policy research, we needed a civil engineer, and we'd bring somebody from their center. And so what happened literally was the development of kind of this underground internal market within the university that most people didn't even realize that there was all this interaction going on across colleges, across fields, across centers, because it was all taking place outside of the regular bureaucracy. Now, when some people find that, it scares them to death. But this is kind of a technical point. But one of the things we found that made this all work, anybody's familiar with the iPads data, I'm sure Fred is. One thing made all the difference was instead of calling what we were doing grants and contracts, we started calling it educational sales and services, which is a different line. And the minute you did that, it just opened up the world to entrepreneurial activity, because now we were completely out from under that whole sponsored research bureaucracy and not subject to any of those regulations. Now, of course, as that was my purpose of my question to Fred, then the fear was, oh my God, what are they doing out there? The rules don't apply to them. My God, what's going to happen? Well, nothing ever happened really. But back to your point, this kind of activity sort of became infectious. And once one group saw somebody do it, they started asking, so, well, how can I take my skills and turn them into this as well? And so one center after another just started to clone themselves across the entire campus on every college, in fact. I think you're muted.
Thank you. I have some more questions, but I want to give Richard Davila, do you have a question for our guest presenter today?
I don't. This is a new idea to me, and I think I'd like to spend some time with the book before I weigh in.
Okay, thanks. Brian?
So mine was the question in the chat that Clyde got like halfway through. I am still interested to see if there are dangers in kind of reinforcing, like using that entrepreneurial language. I know you use the definition from economists, but it strikes me as maybe this is just kind of what you said, which is that like that ship has sailed. It's already been fully legitimized. There's no more kind of reinforcing that we can do. So it's better to kind of lean into it, maybe we might say. But
yeah, I would say that's probably one of the most frequent criticisms that I've heard, and I understand it and I recognize the dangers of it. But entrepreneurialism is about taking risks, so I'm prepared to take the risk because I don't see what the alternative is. Well, I do, but I don't think the alternatives have worked.
So Clyde, in terms of the lessons learned, you say your center was eliminated, so were all the other ones and so forth. I mean, what was the force of the bureaucracy, or what were the forces at play that really diminished the transformation possibilities of these ideas?
Yeah, well, it came from a lot of different directions, so I'll just kind of use an example from each one. Certainly, the staff bureaucracy around research, grants and contracts, administration and finance, we're always nervous about this unaccounted for money. And I say unaccounted for because our budget ran through the UMass Foundation, which meant it didn't run through the administration and finance bureaucracy. So to them, it was invisible. Now, it wasn't invisible to other administrators, and it was audited and just like any other accounts. But in their mind, there was always the suspicion that there was something untold going on here. There was some kind of corruption here that had to be rooted out, that was hidden from them, which was just utterly preposterous. I would say from the faculty union, which I was a member of and eventually quit over some of these issues, this was an unbargained entity. We weren't in the collective bargaining agreement. And I'll give you a simple example. One of the things I did at one point is because our staff and researchers traveled a lot around New England. And so I said, let's buy everybody a AAA membership, because it's cold in New England, batteries die, tires go flat. And it was a marginal expense. I mean, $75 a year is just nothing. But the union intervened and said, you can't have that because it's an unbargained benefit. And if you're going to offer a benefit to one group of faculty, it has to be offered to everybody. I got around that with my coffee maker by saying it was for customers rather than for employees. But we would get those kinds of issues. With the Senate, it would be things like, well, they're able to pay themselves additional compensation because it's not state money. They can fly first class. They have all these privileges and perquisites, and they're living so well, which, by the way, we were. And that's not fair to the rest of us. You need to make them give us their money. And we were like, no, it's like, if you work for it, we'll share it with you, but you got to come over here and do some of the work. We're not giving it away. So there was that kind of tension. And then, of course, there was the usual, anything you do off campus is going to generate some controversy, whether it's good or not. You can be utterly scientifically objective, but the consequences of your research will not be politically neutral. So there's always going to be a state legislator calling the chancellor's office to complain, or a local mayor or a city councilor. And you really need a strong administration that's prepared to rebuff that and to protect you. We had that for a while, and we were very fortunate. But once sort of that cornerstone brick cracks, it was really all over for all of us.
Thank you. Yeah, sounds like typical human attributes, a little bit of desire for control, a little bit of envy.
Yeah, a little bit of both. Yeah. And let me add one last thing. Here's one other very important thing. Because we were a policy research center, obviously we interacted a lot with government and with the media. We reached a point where, as the director of that center, I could call the Speaker of the House. I could call the governor's chief of staff. I had independent credibility and access to the media throughout New England. That really scares a lot of people in positions of power.
Mm-hmm. One thing I would mention on this matter, and again, my own thinking about these things has gone through an evolution, for everyone. We go through evolutions, but nothing is forever. The university will never be what we want it to be. That's one reason why it's probably pointless to use the university as an organizing principle. And it would be very easy to say, well, Clyde, what you did is all well and fine, but it really was a failure. It doesn't exist anymore. And again, through a conventional filter, a conventional view, maybe, but not really. If you take the starting point that nothing is forever, when you're pushing against the grain, to be able to accomplish what you did for the time frame you did is extraordinary. And the other point too is that, and I would go back to what Fred said, is that just, things aren't forever, but after you're done, even if the initiative that you led no longer exists by name, there is always the question of what residue is left. Who's doing what? And what you do when you go back, you find that there is a lot of it that still lives, maybe not by the same name, maybe not using the same platform. But we have to really conclude that we are pushing against the grain, that universities as corporatized, politicized environments will always find a way to advance whatever the institution seeks to advance, and very quietly in some ways not so quietly, undercut what you're doing, because it's a threat. It's a threat to the mainstream. So I think that, but I think what it really boils down to is that you still have to have the leadership skills to be able to scan an environment, look for those spaces between the planks to create those networks and collaborations that enable this work to go forward. And I think one of the challenges I see in my colleagues, both administrative and faculty, is that they'll watch a video like today and they'll say, well, how do you do that? And it's a really important question because they don't know how to do it. That doesn't mean they're not good colleagues, but I think what it does is accentuate the value of those who can, like Fred administratively, like Clyde administratively, and also as a faculty member. And I think the other thing is you can learn from them if you observe what they're doing, pay attention in real time. You'll be able to learn and hopefully absorb some of that and apply it in your own practice.
Yeah, that's a great point, Fred. And I would add to that, with a lot of it, you learn as you go. You know, when we started, we didn't really know what we were doing, but we would imitate other people. We would look and read to see what other people, we would learn from mistakes. And it does take a high risk tolerance, because at every step of the way, there was, given the public visibility of the kind of work we were doing, there was always the prospect of catastrophic failure and embarrassment. And you just have to live with that.
Yeah. I had a colleague the other day, I was doing a program, and one of the points he made was that he was talking about trying to be, how do you, what's the recipe for success? And he said, the most important thing is to buy a really high quality pair of earplugs. Because if you're really doing good work, you're going to be slaughtered. There are going to be people who are talking about you. There are going to be people who will want to stop you. And his point, which I thought was really endearing, he said, there is no such thing as a mission for the world. It's your mission. And other people may not share that mission. Just put on a pair of earplugs and keep moving forward and learning.
Good point. Yeah, I remember when we would be on a really high profile or controversial project, my practice was to not read any of the press coverage until at least 3 days after the fact, because I didn't want to be caught up in the day-to-day push and pull.
Right.
Who said
Right.
stay on course.
That's right. Good point.
Well, you know, I think all programs have a time where they can be successful or not be successful. And we've all seen plenty of programs that were great ideas, but the timing wasn't right to start them. And likewise, they have a life cycle and they go for periods of time, and then change comes along and wipes it out. I think in this political environment, however, I would have to say that the risks are much greater than it was when I was practicing. I'm well aware of, Clyde, you mentioned you have to stand tall and protect basically the faculty against political concerns. In the jobs I was in, that was a constant problem. But if I look at the environment that we live in today, I think it would be much harder to do that.
Yeah, I agree.
And but I still think there's room to be entrepreneurial in that. And while I'm not sure I'd like to be in a university where every faculty member was doing that, because you still have to teach students and you still have to do some of the regular activities that go on. It's extremely exciting to be in an institution where you have a rich intellectual environment, entrepreneurial environment like that to work in.
Yeah, let me say a word about teaching, if we still have a couple of minutes to go here, sort of a different take on it. One of the things that our activities allowed us to do was to bring lots of students into our organization for kind of hands-on experience with survey research, going out and doing field research, internships. So they really got the inside experience on how to do that. It's a different type of teaching, But I used to always have to make the argument, we are teaching. We're teaching every day, and it's much more intense one-on-one types of tutoring than what you get in a classroom with 35 or 50 people. The other thing that I argued was we used to keep records of the invited talks. We did lots of talks in the community. Well, that's teaching too. It's not teaching our students, but it's still teaching and it's still education of high value. And we did hundreds of hours of that every year among the group.
Thank you, Clyde and Fred, for those comments. I'm wondering, you were talking about the two ideologies. You started out talking about two ideologies, and I'm wondering if, I mean, either of those could be seen as ideal types, but I would say that probably the public university did have some kind of semi-autonomy that kind of blended those two ideologies. And I'm wondering if neoliberalism has transformed that semi-autonomy into sort of making the university kind of the servant of capital. And if you could speak to some of that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I'm going to dissent from you on that particular point. I would say there was the illusion of autonomy because the University of the Golden Age was so much in sync with the Keynesian welfare state that there was not a conflict between the two. So if there was a time when the university was a complete servant of I don't know what you want to call it, capital or whatever, but the university as we knew it in the Golden Age, so-called, was part of the Keynesian welfare state, was a direct extension of it in every way, from promotion of social mobility to research that supported the programs and economic management of that. So I would suggest it was an illusion of autonomy because there was no direct conflict between the two in the way there is today or in the way there was before. But I would also say, let's not forget that even in the heyday of that golden age, there was the McCarthy era. There were legions of people who got fired in the 60s and 70s for challenging that liberal consensus. So it was a golden age for a small group of elite faculty at elite institutions, but I don't think it was a golden age for most people. And that's not even getting into issues of race and gender.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. So where do you see the university going?
Yeah. You know, I guess I fluctuate between deep pessimism and bursts of optimism. I think we're in a very treacherous position right now. And as I said at the very beginning, I don't see things getting better for the most part, partly because of the political circumstances that we find ourselves in. I don't think budgets will ever get better in the traditional sense that we remember them for, say, the 50s, 60s, well, not even the 70s. So I'm worried. I'm really worried about the future of the university more than I am optimistic about it, which is partly why, you know, some people have accused me in this book of being sort of defeatist. And, you know, that what I've argued for is we can create small little enclaves and oases that temporarily give us some shelter. And to a large degree, that is what I'm arguing for. And maybe it's kind of an extension of Adorno's hibernation strategy, that all we can do right now is sort of create little hiding spaces for ourselves until this all blows over, which it may not, and at least find footholds from which to operate. But right now, I think that's where we're at.
I guess I'm more optimistic, and maybe it's because I've retired and I'm out of the fray. But I think the universities will survive and thrive. They're just going to do it different than we are currently doing it. I think, you know, we're watching a close to maybe an era, as Clive was talking about, but it's impossible to put that many smart people together and have them interact and not find a better way to do things as you do it. And so I have faith, at least in the gestalt called the university. There are a lot of different facets to it. I used to be astounded when I'd talk to people outside the university and they say, oh, the university never changes. And if you're inside the university, it's constant chaos. I mean, it's total chaos in some respects whenever you look at that, with new ideas floating around. The real question to me is where is the university going to find the leadership to be able to lead, take advantage of some of these ideas and be able to move in new directions? And if you're going to do that, you need to select leaders and not use car salesmen to run them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would extend on that as one of the worrisome tendencies in that respect is, there was a time when you went from being a chair to a dean to a provost and maybe a president, and even though it might have been 20 years since you were in a classroom, you had that experience and that background. Now we're just popping people right out of the corporate world who think they know stuff that they don't know, and that's trickling down, right, even to the level of deans now. So yeah, I don't think we have what I would call real academic leadership more and more. We have corporate CEOs who frankly haven't done a particularly good job in their own sphere of expertise.
I worked for a president one time who brought a bunch of corporate leaders in and planted them inside the university. Every one of them left. And what I heard frequently was, I really didn't want to work that hard. There's a whole lot more to this running a university than there is in a corporation.
Yep.
And you can't really run a university truly like you run a corporation, in my opinion.
I agree. In fact, one of the arguments I've made more and more is I think universities are more like small cities than they are corporations. You have to govern them. You can't manage them.
Exactly. But it doesn't hurt to recognize a parade and being able to get out in front of it.
I want to get back to something you mentioned earlier, Clyde. That's the notion of academic freedom.
Yep.
And I know you've done work or examined the work of Charles Beard, whom stepped out of Columbia because he didn't appreciate the way some faculty members were fired, and he never got back into academia again, as I understand it.
Yep.
But given this emphasis on entrepreneurialism, and also what I would call the production of knowledge, that is, to some extent, this entrepreneurial activity is about producing, in some instances, what some might call vulgar empiricism, a bunch of little studies that just micro stuff here and there. But, as a sociologist and political scientist, one would think that we would have time to write and think about and contemplate the bigger trends in society and the changes in society. And I'm seeing kind of a lack of those kinds of things, even though you yourself seem to be able to do both of them. You have the picture works and also the micro works and so on. But in terms of the role of the university in society, how do you see the balance between these two aspects?
Yeah. Well, first, let me start by saying that, doing both simultaneously is you get vertigo, right? One day I'm thinking about how many gallons of sewer water the city pumps, and then the next day I'm thinking about the state. It's like, and you're going back and forth. I think what we did, a lot of it was, as you say, just like little sort of micro empiricist stuff of no lasting value from an academic standpoint, certainly a value in terms of this impact on the communities we were working in. One of the things we did eventually discover, however, was how to convert that into academic research. Sometimes it was just a case study, using it as a case study that we could plug in to a theoretical model and use it to test that. But I think the more important thing for us was that what all of that kind of sort of tedious, really mind-numbingly boring policy work did for us is it generated the revenue and the space that allowed us to then do the stuff that really interested us. to use those revenues to fund the kind of research and the release time to engage in the more theoretical academic research. So in the long run, it gave us more autonomy than many faculty would have had. And we just kind of viewed this as the price we had to pay to get there. But yeah, some of it was just really boring.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm glad to see that it does have some positive impact on that opportunity to think about the big picture.
Yeah, and you'd be surprised sometimes at the theoretical issues that come up in the context of that kind of work. It might not make it into a policy paper, but it's something you carry out with you later.
Right. Yeah. Frank, any comments on your part?
Well, I've really enjoyed the comments, the commentary. Fred talked about faith. I'll add another virtue to this, and it's hope. You know, I hope, using that word, that those who may view this at some future date, who aren't with us today, will benefit from the discourse that we've had here. There is always hope. The university is changing significantly. We know that. I mean, I was thinking about this as you were talking, Fred. It hasn't been all that long since you and I have left everyday service. And who would have been able to predict that the landscape would have changed so significantly? Because things have become so much more politicized to the point that you don't have a lot of degrees of freedom. And also, and I know this is a common issue for faculty, it's so difficult for them, even when they're sort of built to do the kind of work that Clyde is talking about, how difficult it is because there are so many rules and regulations and boundaries and policies and expectations and threats that you must conform, you must function within these boundaries. And the one thing that I've seen is those boundaries are getting more narrow and more narrow all the time. And so, but you have to have hope. And I was thinking about this the other day as I was talking with some people who work in the political arena. What they're finding is previously successful, I don't want to say politicians alone, but organizers, politicians certainly, those in political office, but also organizers are finding that sort of the tried and true recipes that got them where they are today aren't working anymore because the circumstances have become so much more complex. And so I think one of the things that I think is tied to this concept of hope is that we each have to find a way to up our game. You can't do the same old, same old. You've got to be able to raise your game to fit the circumstances as they evolve. And that also means pay attention to what's going on. You know, Clyde talked about there's more than resistance, and it's easy to be critical, and I've done more of my share along those lines. But in addition to that, pay attention so you can ask yourself, okay, as Fred said, when you move beyond the mouth and you focus on the legs, what exactly are you going to do to be successful in an increasingly complex and politicized environment? And, you know, a lot of us as faculty members are not built for that. And it's the reason we ended up in academia. And so there's a lot of frustration out there, but you have to have hope. And I think talking about it is the first step.
Well, and I was interested in Clyde's discussion of his success with this center. And obviously, Clyde, you sensed that the time was right where you were, and there was an opportunity there to be able to build that. Build it, you did, you succeeded with that. And when the system sort of closed around you to a place where it wasn't in at least operational the way you wanted it to be, you essentially left it and went someplace else.
That's
But
right.
on the other hand, if you look, as I've looked at some very entrepreneurial faculty over the course of their careers, where they've worked 30 or 40 years at one institution. I can think of examples where they've been able to develop 2 or 3 different entrepreneurial activities over time. Yeah, the system closed around one, but they sort of put their head down, and after a while they figured out another one to go with. And I guess that's what I have faith in.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, you're making me think. I can't remember who this was that I saw say that, but it was a fairly famous entrepreneur in the corporate world. And along those lines, he says, the real thing is the willingness to fail.
Yeah.
Mhm.
He says, everybody remembers my big success. Nobody remembers I failed 9 times getting there.
Right. Exactly right. Exactly right. And, it's, when you look at entrepreneurs, I also was the president of Research Foundation. And when you look at entrepreneurs, coming up with ideas and starting companies and doing various things, and they can excel at that right up to the point where they have to ramp it up and operationalize it. And most of them fail. And to a large extent, you got to hand those things off to other people and let them take and go with it in the direction they need to go in, which is what you've done as you look at that. And I think that's true of Frank, and I would like to think myself as well. So.
Thank you, Fred. I know that being down in South Texas, Clyde, you are familiar with Mexican music and Tex-Mex music.
Yes.
Your experience reminds me of a lyric in one of the songs that I'm familiar with regarding envy, and says, and this relates to your experience, it says in Spanish, they don't want what I have, they just don't want me to have it.
I relate to that 100%. Yeah.
That's a human experience.
In fact, we just had a college town hall that fits under that umbrella.
I want to thank you for joining us today and engaging in this conversation with us. I think it's been a very fruitful conversation. I want to thank Fred for joining us, Brian and Richard and Frank for your comments as well. I also want to thank everybody who joined us online, and looking forward to the next Future U Forum.